Well,
Hello.
good evening. Howdy, good.
It
How's it
must be
going tonight,
it,
Ron?
good. Seeing that you're on my computer, it must be Monday again.
It is indeed Monday. Our hopefully triumphant return after the holiday season. I
Oh, it's-
saw Mary Beth in there. Hey Dan, good to see you. So here's a question: how was everybody's holiday season? Hopefully, y'all had a good time. I don't know whether you celebrate Christmas, Hanukkah, Yule, Diwali, anything like that. Whatever you celebrated, hope you guys had a wonderful holiday season. It was nice and relaxing for me. How was yours, Ron?
it was good. It was not relaxing at the least because of course, I've got children, so it was a living hell on earth. But we still have the tree up, so we still have a little bit of that going on. That will probably be up to I would assume right around the 4th of July, I would think. And then, but yeah, for what it's worth, it was a great time. Got to see people that I haven't seen for a while, and it was great.
Excellent. Well, see, I don't have children, and so I've got mostly just older family left, and so everybody takes it a little bit easier, a little bit slower. So it was on the chill side for me. So I didn't mind that so much either.
Right. Well, you know what I did, and this was a wrong move on my part. I thought that the children, as kind of a late Christmas gift, I decided that we would get a puppy for the family,
Oh
and
boy.
it's been a while. It's been a while since we've had a puppy, and I got them on Australian Shepherd, and so it was like the first day was, Dad, we love you so much. This is great, and then 24 hours later. Dad, is there anything way you can sell this dog? I don't want to put up with it anymore. So
Oh,
it was that kind of thing at the household. So yeah,
puppies are a lot of work. I mean, they're wonderful, but boy, they do take a lot of investment.
they do. Yes. So that's what I'm working with right now. Trying to house train a puppy and all that good stuff. But I'm here. And last week, folks, I want to apologize that life got in the way. And unfortunately, I had to work, and I contacted Chris, and I said I'm not going to be able to make the show because I'm really looking forward to this show. But we're all here gathered today, and we're going to have a one hell of a show. HEL, wink, wink, there, Chris.
Giving away the ghost there.
That's
So
right.
yeah,
That's right.
life does happen, and we always are very thankful that you guys are patient with us. Every now and again things get in the way. We have technical difficulties and everything, but we try to keep it coming and keep it fresh for you guys. And actually, I'm particularly excited about tonight's show. I'm sure that many of you have seen that we'll be doing a show tonight on Norse mythology, and I feel like as world mythologies go over the last probably 10 to 15 years, people have become much more familiar with Norse mythology than often people were before, as a result of things like the TV show Vikings, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which uses aspects of Norse mythology. And I'm a huge fan of all those movies, and so I'm really looking forward to tonight's show and exploring a little bit of what the original Norse mythology was all about. Now, I know you said, Ron, that you are also familiar with Norse mythology. Have you been a fan since childhood, or where do you come from on that?
I think with the comic books, but as I was kind of thinking about this show coming up and what kind of angle I wanted to take, we are all, whether we are aware or not, and somehow imbued in our world with Norse mythology, whether it's part of our culture. And
Very much
even though
is.
we don't understand where it comes from, we still use it every day. And I think as we go through the program tonight, people will be amazed at how often we use the ideas of Norse culture on a daily basis.
Yeah, there's actually some very, very profound connections between Old Norse mythology and the Old Norse religions, and what we see on a daily basis. And so I am really sort of excited to get into that as well. Now, for me, I did start with Norse mythology as a kid, when I was probably 11 or 12 years old, and there was a magazine store that was directly on my way to school, and I used to scrape up 35 or 45 cents from my mom's coin jar on her dresser, and whenever I could, once a week, to pick up a comic book. And
Mhm.
one particular day on my way to school, I picked up a comic that I'd never seen before, but the cover was particularly cool looking, and it was an issue of the Mighty Thor. And I didn't know anything about this character, but I love superheroes. I knew that it was part of the Marvel universe with Spider-Man and Captain America, who I really liked, and so I picked up the comic. And as it happens, kind of a very lucky sort of twist of fate is that while most issues of that comic book, like any other, were full of superheroes and supervillains and set in sort of the modern 20th century, this particular issue was Thor number 272, and it was not anything like their normal ones. The entire issue actually retold several stories from original Norse mythology. So I kind of really hit the jackpot with this. It had stories taken directly from the Old Norse, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. I thought the entire story and everything that happened in it was wonderful, and it became a treasured character of mine. I ended up continuing to read Thor comics for many, many years after that, and he's always remained a very, very favorite character. But as I think must be probably obvious to almost anyone, that the Thor character in the movies and in the comic books is not specifically or not exactly the comic from old mythology. They've changed him and sort of changed the nature of it because we don't live in an old ancient Norse pagan world anymore, and they needed to make this character fit into a modern universe. But they did take the inspiration from that, and it was something that I have loved all these many years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember there was a cartoon on as well whenever I was a kid. And I'm not sure if it was solely Mighty Thor, but I know that every now and then they would weave his character into the program. And it was very deep in Norse mythology, and it didn't go into any kind of explanation either. It was just showing it to a kid. So whenever you're 8, 9 years old, you kind of catch on after a while, and you understand that this is part of a really cool culture that I want to look deeper into.
Well, it's funny because I think a lot of people, certainly adults, often think that comic books are sort of a lower form of entertainment, and that they're, they're not worthy of being considered literature. But as a result of reading these Thor issues that I read back then, I ended up picking up books on actual Norse mythology and became fascinated with the original mythology as well. And so that book, that comic book, led me to be a better reader and led me to get into world culture. So I consider that to be a win-win. And certainly, it was the comic book that was the gateway drug for me to get into, some real world literature.
Right. Well, that's a good point too, and that's what I was going to say. Is as a literature major in college, whenever we explore the world of Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, without some sort of working knowledge of Norse mythology, you can be very quickly lost. So all these people, even though we're dealing with an English author here, it delves so heavily on the Norse tradition. And as we talked before, right around Christmas time, without the Norse mythology, we would not have Santa Claus as we know him.
And so many other characters, again, who are sort of interpretations or later versions of it. By the way, Mary Beth, that was very funny. You were saying that you had a kitten that you had named Freya until he ended up growing boy parts. Of course, luckily the Norse guy had you covered on that one, because Freyr, with the R on the end, was the brother and or husband of Freya in the old mythology. So it'd be an easy transfer for that one as well. But yeah, just for those of you, in case anyone here, I imagine a lot of you folks have seen these the Marvel movies. If anybody has not, there are 4 movies specifically just set in the Thor sort of universe. So far was the original Thor, Thor 2, The Dark World, Thor 3, Ragnarok, and Thor 4, Love and Thunder, which I would not say would be my highest recommended of the 4. But for those of you who are interested in seeing sort of an interpretation of Norse mythology after the fact, if you haven't seen these, they are a great deal of fun, as are most of the Marvel movies. But we're really not going to focus heavily on the Marvel tonight. We're going to be talking a little bit about, of course, the original mythology that inspired them. And I think it's interesting that the Norse pagans, or rather the pagan religion of the Old Norse people, lasted until pretty, around 1,000 years ago, which is pretty impressive. Christianity was spreading across England, but the Norse didn't write an awful lot of things down. They had runes, which they could use for like simple incantations and spells, for inscriptions on stones and graves, but they weren't in the habit of writing extensive histories of themselves. Almost all of their history was oral. So most of what we know about the ancient Norse today actually comes from the poetic Eddas. The Eddas are the Volsunga saga and the Vinland saga and things like that, but they were written 200 or 300 years later by monks who were generally Christian. And so there is some sort of, some speculation that they inserted their own philosophies in here, that they inserted their own interpretations. And so it's hard to say with absolute certainty. exactly what the Norse belief was, but because there is a lot of sort of carryover in what we see in the different Eddas that were written by these different monks over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, plus Old Norse tablets and things like that, we've been able to sort of come up with a pretty good sense of what the Norse believed, and we know a lot about their core beliefs. Maybe not all of the the finer details, but we can see that across the Scandinavian countries there was a lot of commonality of belief, and they did kind of share a pretty similar system.
Yeah, you got to watch out for those pesky monks, because even whenever you look at Christian writings, you can see a lot of times their fingerprints are in the details as well too, and they'll throw their own philosophies in there as well. So whenever you look at the ancient world, a lot of times the Norse and especially the Vikings get a horrible rap simply because these were raiders, and they had a great very negative dealings with the church. So it's very possible that a lot of our history that comes to us is based upon some sort of retribution after the fact, in writing rather than in sword and fire. But yeah, so you have to be very careful whenever you go through the histories.
Considering the Viking raids on northern England, the Irish coastline, the European coastline, etc., and the fact that they frequently preyed on monasteries and things like that, where there were a lot of treasures and they were very poorly defended. I would imagine that it's almost amazing that the Vikings have anything but a monstrous portrayal in these Eddas, because they were the boogeymen of these of those times. The 800s, the 900s, when the Vikings first really started to raid across to the coastline of what would later become England. Wasn't fully England yet. It was more like disparate communities at that time. But they were a terror. They were they were literally a holy terror, because they were, preying so much on monasteries. So I think I have to give the monks some credit for a little bit of, what's the word, diplomacy in the way they portrayed them, because they're not always portrayed negatively in the Eddas. And actually the Eddas often are pretty straightforward. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they definitely got a little bit of a negative reputation, which is exactly what happens when you storm into a monastery with your axe in hand. So.
That's right. But I know that when we look at the histories of Lindisfarne, one of the famous places where the Vikings raided, you can see the monks talking about the dragons coming,
Yeah.
and the problem, the Viking ships often had a decorative piece that looked like a dragon. So you have this mythology building up around these people already. You have the idea of dragons, and I think you also have the idea of werewolves coming from this time period as well too, as we talked about the idea of the berserkers and everything like that. But one point that I do want to make before we move on is that when we talk about these Vikings attacking monasteries, they weren't doing it because they were religious. They were doing it because there was a lot of treasure there.
Exactly, and that was their culture. They were Vikings were the sort of the raid. They were the pirates in a sense of the Norse people. But unlike pirates, the way we think of them today, they were respected. They were highly regarded in Norse communities, and it was the wealth that they brought back that kept these Nordic countries alive. And so they were heroes to their own people, despite the fact that to much of the rest of the the Western world they were considered very monstrous. And because of that, the gods and heroes of the Viking religion, of the Nordic religion, it's hard sometimes, to distinguish between Viking and Nordic. The Vikings were the people who went raiding. The Vikings weren't the people of, the Nordic countries. They were the raiders. They were the specific people with that job. And many of them were also farmers and had other lives, but it was, if you went raiding, you were a Viking. But the people themselves were, they were the Norse, they were the Danes, they were the Greenlanders, etc., but generally all the Nordic countries. And because they lived in a very harsh environment, their climate was very, very difficult to farm, because they were right on the doorstep of the Arctic Circle. They lived a harsh life, and their gods were fairly down to earth and fairly harsh as well. So their gods were gods of battle, and also lived very human lives. Now, Thor, who we tend to perceive, sort of, as they say in modern culture, as a superhero, was one of the gods of the ancient Norse religion. And collectively, the many gods of the Nordic world were called the Aesir. And Thor himself was the god of storms, battle, strength, and of all strange things of fertile land. So a lot of these gods had multiple job descriptions, which is not unusual at that time too. And what's very common through a lot of old world pagan religions too is that there were what we call local gods, which is that different villages, different people, different regions would have a patron god, and one area might be dedicated specifically to Thor, one might be dedicated specifically to Odin or to Freya or to even to Loki, although I would say that Loki, probably, who we'll discuss a little bit later, would be the least likely to be venerated by an entire village, although there would be individuals who had a particular affinity with a character like Loki.
Right. The interesting thing about Thor is because this was a very, very popular god in Norse mythology, and often you would see this Thor's hammer, this kind of emblem, going with the Vikings, because one of the main reasons later on why Vikings did their conquest was to find farmland. You know, they wanted to be farmers. So to have a god who was so invested in the fertility of the land was something that was very important to them. And as far as the anthropomorphism of these gods, they are indeed pragmatic. They are coming from a very harsh culture, but they're always looking outward as well, too. You know, there's always that sense of something over the horizon, which I really kind of find very admirable, too, about these gods, because, you know, they do occupy a particular place in time, but they also can be sent out and almost evangelized in a way as well, because they mean so many different things to so many different people.
Well, and the people of these Nordic nations, the Scandinavian lands, believed that their gods walked among them. They believed that, you know, Odin and Freya and these different gods would show up on your doorstep. That if you saw a wanderer, you know, come to your door, it may well be Odin or Thor in disguise. And so they were very, very hospitable. They always had made a point, whenever possible, to you know, to show strangers and to show wanderers the greatest of hospitality, because you never knew when your god would show up at your door or visit. They believed that their gods walked among them, which is an interesting thing, which you don't usually see in these later, you know, sort of pagan or pantheistic religions. Usually that kind of thing, you trace it back to ancient Greek religion or ancient, you know, Roman religion, or even Egyptian, which goes back so much farther in time, but only 1,000 years ago. Again, when we sort of, the Western world, the way we know it today, was actually really beginning to come into itself, to still have such a very pagan religion and sort of a pagan worldview coming from a very large group of people is actually quite unusual to see.
It is. One of my theories regarding this is that these gods and the goddesses of this pantheon may indeed have been representative of very real people at one time. So there might have been a warlord like Loki or like Thor, you know, and it developed from that, because they are so immediately human. You know, even whenever I think about the pantheon of the Greeks, they are still a little bit different. You know, even though they can walk among the people as well too, they're still a little bit more aloof. But the gods of the Norse mythology, they are approachable, and not only approachable, but they also approach you as well.
Exactly. I mean, you could easily expect to interact with them, and people saw them in their everyday world. They saw everything around them as being, you know, as being evidence of the gods. Now, the leader, the great god among gods of the ancient Norse religion, of course, was Odin. Odin, the All-Father, Odin, the All-Seeing, greatest of all the Norse gods. He was called the All-Seeing because in one of the great Norse myths, Odin sacrificed one of his eyes to the well of Mimir in order to gain knowledge specifically to be able to see into the future. And he was the great father god. But what's interesting about Odin and things like sacrificing an eye is that this is, again, it's such a mortal concept. It's such a sort of a temporal concept, and suggests that the idea, and we know this from Norse mythology, that these gods could even be physically wounded. They were not immortal in the, you know, in the cosmic sense. They had great strength, they had great longevity, but they lived, they died, they were subject to, you know, Odin's father, you know, is referred to in the, you know, in the old myths, and the people that Odin came from. Their creation myths feel very, very humanized as well. So once again, we have this normality, this almost mundane aspect to the lives and the expectations of their gods that reflected what they themselves were living in their lives. And so despite the fact that the gods were not fully mortal, I mean, the gods lived in this golden realm called Asgard, this beautiful glowing golden city that did not exist on Earth, that existed in this sort of distant realm, but they still lived a comparatively ordinary life. They drank, they made love, they fought amongst themselves, they could betray one another, and even Odin, the all-knowing, somebody got the drop on him from time to time. So again, gods that were tremendously humanized and not nearly as distant and aloof as the way we see them today. We tend to see gods in general today across the world.
Right, they had their foibles and they had their shortcomings, just like modern humans, which is one of the reasons why they're so utterly approachable, and also one of the reasons why I think it took so long for this culture to become Christianized, because it's very difficult for us to live up to the standards of, say, what Jesus preached, than to what Odin wished you would do, because he understood the human condition completely, right? And so.
The idea is that Christianity seemed immensely impractical to them. The
Right,
idea of
exactly, right.
these people who denied themselves, worldly pleasures. They would meet these monks, and the monks were celibate. The monks, lived these very, very, sort of austere lives. They didn't take wives. They often ate plain foods and things like that, and that was completely anathema to everything that the Vikings believed in. And so the idea, they saw their gods as either ridiculous or weak. And in fact, they would observe that the Christians were worshiping a man nailed to a cross, essentially a dead god, and to them that just was beyond the pale. And so it was a very, very difficult transition, and it took centuries for the Vikings to begin to accept Christianity, and it was more through a slow osmosis than any real large-scale conversion, and often it was political expedience.
Oh, absolutely. Especially whenever we look at Normandy and whenever they start settling places in England and in Ireland as well too, it was just a matter of keeping up with the locals, right? I mean, we were already here. We don't want to rock the boat anymore, and there's intermarriage going on, and of course that would happen just through as you said, through osmosis. But another point that I want to make out before we go a little bit further is when we talk about the Vikings and we talk about the Norse, we often think of them as being very barbaric. But we know from history on both sides, as a matter of fact, that these were clean people. You know what? I mean, they bathed regularly. They took time with their appearance. We know they used combs. So these were not just your rowdy, sweaty, stinky barbarians. These were also cultured people in a way that most of Europe would not understand.
No, and again, we have burials of Vikings that have that have combs, they still have hair. We can see that they braided and plaited their hair in very elaborate ways. They even experimented with hair dyes and things like that, and so they were very concerned with their appearance. They had beautifully embroidered clothing that they wore. So no, they weren't running around in rags and animal skins. And they were barbarians, I suppose, in the way we tend to think of it, sort of as a cultural way, but they were not uncivilized by any means.
Absolutely.
Now, we were talking a little while ago about the Aesir, the sort of the primary gods of them, and a real big disclaimer here. Norse mythology is a massive subject, and tonight we're going to give a pretty vague overview. There are going to be, things that are not covered. There are definitely, if you are a fan of Norse mythology, you probably may say, "Oh, I can't believe they didn't talk about this." We could never cover the entire subject in a single evening, and so this is definitely a kind of a Cliff's Notes version of the Norse religions, but some of the most notable gods, and figures in ancient Norse mythology, kind of they had a real god for every purpose. You had Odin, the Allfather, the one-eyed, and his wife Frigga. You had Thor, the thunder god, the god of strength, and one of the many war gods of Norse mythology. You had Loki, and we're going to go into some detail about Loki a little bit later on. Who, depending on the versions you read, was either the brother of Odin or the brother, or specifically half brother of Thor. The Eddas and the different myths do argue over that a little bit, and so it's really hard to say for sure which role he took on. Tyr, another war god. Tyr is almost always portrayed as having lost a hand, which was bitten off by the great wolf Fenris, who we'll discuss later on. Heimdall, who was the overseer of the Rainbow Bridge, this sort of pathway, this mystical pathway by which people came to the realm of Asgard. Balder the Beautiful. Balder the Beautiful is the most the closest to a Christian figure in the Viking mythology. He is this pure being of basically light and beauty. He is without sin. He's without, a cruel or wrathful thought. He's this Christ-like figure, and actually will end up portraying a sort of a version of a Christ figure later on. And again, we're going to discuss that. And then Freya and Freyr, the two who were both brother and sister and husband and wife. We don't know if it was supposed to truly be both of those, or what there's some confusion in the Eddas, but Freya and Freyr always essentially like two sides of the same coin. Freya being a goddess of love and frequently prayed to by women who were carrying children or trying to pray for the well-being of their children. And a really interesting character is Idun. Idun was the keeper of a tree that was blossomed with golden apples. And these golden apples were the sources of the gods' power. It was believed that if the gods lost the tree, if the tree basically was cut down, or if they lost the apples, they would lose their divinity, they would lose their ability to be gods, and they would fade away and die. And so quite a few stories in the Old Norse myths concern people trying to steal the golden apples of Idun or Iduna. So a lot of different gods that, again, they have a kind of a god for every use and a god for every season. But whether or not you realize it, I would imagine that everyone listening tonight actually makes some reference to some of these gods on a regular basis. Because one thing you may or may not realize is that the days of our week are actually 4 of the days of our week are named for Norse gods. Tyr is lent his name to Tuesday. Odin or Woden, depending on the sort of facet of the culture, gave us the name Wednesday. Thor's Day, and then Freya Day or Freyr Day. So you have 4 Norse gods basically taking up more than half of our week, which is remarkable when you think about that. We're still again using that in a modern, often heavily Christian culture, with not a huge amount of the sort of Nordic Germanic influence in our day-to-day lives, and yet still using Norse, referencing Norse gods every single day of the week, or 4 out of 7 days of the week.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. No, I think that says something about, and we probably all have a little bit of Viking blood in us as well too. I took the ancestry DNA test. Shows I have some Scottish in me, some Irish in me, and some German. But what was really interesting in the test is, whenever we got the DNA back, is that I have 2% Scandinavian in me. So, it kind of shows this progression of how these ideas flow. So I think it's kind of natural that we have this, because this culture it really meant so much to the Irish and the British and the Scottish as well, because that culture was their culture as well too, and they were lending each other different phrases and things. So it's no wonder that we have the days of the week in their names.
Even the people who occupied the British Isles at that time, the Irish, the English, the Normans, the Saxons, etc., were also descended from Germanic tribes. The French were the Franks, who were sort of a Proto-Germanic tribe, and they had all basically split up at different times, spread across the world, and then kind of came back together. But by the time they, centuries had gone by and they came back together, they were at odds with one another and did not recognize each other as kin. But once upon a time, would have all been. I mean, I suppose if you wind the clock back far enough, we're all from the same people, but they had a little bit of a closer association, the Saxons and the Britons certainly, and the Franks then with the Vikings or the Norsemen, than I think that they cared to admit. But they intermarried a great deal as the Vikings started to colonize those areas, and ultimately, England ended up with, Canute, one of the great Viking kings, and so they really did. So if you have Scottish blood, Irish blood, or English blood, chances are you have a fair dose of Viking in you as well.
Right, and the name Dublin is actually a Viking word.
Oh, is it? Now, see, that's not something I knew.
Yes.
Now, the Aesir were the pre-Christian pantheon primarily of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, although it doesn't specifically end there. Those were the primary countries. You also had people from the Nordic countries who went over and colonized Iceland, then later went on and colonized Greenland. And so all of those basically fell under the sort of great umbrella of the Nordic countries. But while that was the earthly realm of the Vikings, they did have a spiritual perspective on the makeup of sort of the great realms of the universe. And that basically comes under Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil was the world tree, and the Viking people, or again, I apologize because I'll flip it back and forth on these things, but the Nordic people believed there was a great world tree at the core of the universe, and the branches of the world tree held up 9 different realms, and these realms were the lands of everything from mortals to gods to giants, and this was their cosmology. And the 9 realms had all specific residents. So you had Asgard. Asgard was the home of the Aesir, the gods. Alfheim, land of the elves. Now, the elves were artists. They were the ones who basically, wrote songs, beauty, paintings. They were the, sort of the creatures of art in the, in the aesthetic sense. And Svartalfheim, which also basically means dark elves, but these were the realm of the dwarves. And the dwarves were artists as well, but they were the creators. They were the forgers, the crafters, and the ones who came up with inventions.
Yeah, think Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, very much Lord of the Rings. In fact, as you were saying before, a great deal of Tolkien's mythology in the Lord of the Rings came from Scandinavian mythology, which is all directly descended from Norse mythology, including many of even the names that you find in those characters.
Right, and look at whenever we come to Midgard next, the mortal world. That's Middle Earth right there, my friend.
Exactly, and it's precisely what it means. So Midgard was the realm of mortals, where the gods and the giants often interacted. You had Jotunheim, the land of the frost giants, and Muspelheim, the land of the fire giants, 2 of the great adversaries of the Aesir, or the gods. Vanaheim. Now, this is interesting because Vanaheim is one of apparently the most misunderstood or most mysterious of the Norse realms, because it's the home of the Vanir, and the Vanir were kind of a demigod. In a lot of ways, in some of our earlier programs, we've discussed the fact that what were once gods in ancient religions often kind of got downgraded and became nature spirits. And in a way, Vanaheim represents that. Vanaheim was the place where these lesser gods, these sort of nature spirits, would reside. And last but not least, the 2 that round it out are Niflheim, the land of mists, which was something of a purgatory, and led to hell. Hell, H-E single L, the realm of the dead. And this is one that I think that we often misunderstand, because the Viking hell was not the same thing as the way we see hell today, but it is where the name comes from. Our idea of hell in the Christian world comes from the name of hell, the land of the dead, in Viking belief, or in Nordic belief.
Yeah. So that even defines our Christian culture to this day.
It very much does. So, Jeff, many don't understand the Norse built trade routes all the way to the Middle East, and one of them one time conquered Constantinople. You're very right. In fact, the Norse explored much farther than most people realize, and they did, in fact, make it to North Africa and to the Middle East, as far as Turkey as well. And it's interesting, in in a recent TV series called Vikings Valhalla, which is a follow-up to the older Vikings TV show. There's a little change they've made, kind of a tweak to history, where one of the jarls, one of the sort of regional rulers, is portrayed as a woman of color. And a lot of people, as too often happens today, were outraged by that, claimed that it was woke and it was ridiculous. But I immediately stepped up and said, listen, we know that the Vikings reached the Middle East. We know that they reached, the Near East, Constantinople and things like that. And they would have taken wives. They would have brought people back. And in fact, one of the things that's an unfortunate truth about the Vikings is they were also in the slave business. Vikings did capture the people they captured. They often did sell as slaves. And so the idea of people in the Viking world having darker skin, having African ancestry, Middle Eastern ancestry, is not unusual. It's not unlikely at all. They certainly would have intermarried, I would think, with these people. It was not uncommon for them to do that. The Vikings were not a particularly prejudiced people. They did not judge other cultures based on skin color or based on being foreign. Their world revolved around their interaction with foreign cultures. And so I think the idea that there would have been darker skinned Vikings, or Vikings that did intermarry with the other cultures that they encountered. We know that they did it throughout the British Isles and and Europe. So there's no reason they wouldn't have done it throughout the Middle East and Africa, where they made landfall as well.
Yeah. And there's also some hints within history that they may have made even as far as China, which is really, and if you think about that, it's very possible. If you were in Constantinople and you're able to pick up some sort of regional trade route, there's really no reason why they could not have made it.
It's entirely possible. I
Wow.
don't know if how much documentation exists on that, but they were remarkable explorers, remarkably resilient, incredibly accomplished seamen. And so I certainly think it's within the realm of
Right.
possibility.
Yeah, one interesting thing is if anybody goes to Jamestown Settlement in Virginia, and you go to that museum right there, they actually have this brick pathway that shows contact with the New World. And the first one, it says Maine 1000 AD Vikings. So and I found that startling because there's really no definitive proof that they made it to Maine. And this was in a in a regular museum, put on by the Park Service and everything, that there is these subtle hints that the Vikings, who the seafarers that we know that they were, may have actually made it to Maine, nearly 500 years before Columbus.
And that's certainly not a particular stretch to imagine that they may have done that, because we do know that they made it in Newfoundland.
Yes.
What the Vikings referred to, in their in their sagas and in their writings as Vinland, has been, it's still within the realm of debate, but it's been pretty solidly concluded that it refers specifically to Newfoundland, to areas in northern Canada, which would be basically within a stone's throw by Viking terms. Again, these incredibly accomplished journeyers and seamen to get to Maine. So if they had continued anywhere southward from there, they had settlements. We found evidence of that. So it's very well within the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Which would be an interesting show to think about if there was any contact that we could find to the First Nations people here in America, and how their religion may have influenced the religions here in this world as well too.
There's a fair amount of evidence that they did encounter the indigenous peoples of Newfoundland at the time, and that did not always work out so well. Unfortunately, we don't know if there was much communication between them and their languages, but we do know that there was some contact. There is some record of that, and so it would be interesting to see again if they brought anyone back, if there was any intermarriage or any sort of intermingling of the cultures in that way. We don't know that for sure, but again, those are kind of the things that are always fascinating in terms of the realms of possibility. I wanted to quickly touch on something, because it's something that was hugely important in the Norse culture, is that there's a realm in a sense that we did not mention, but one very important, because it isn't precisely a realm unto itself, but it is Valhalla. If you know anything about Vikings, because they were such a war-oriented people, such conquest-oriented people, Vikings believed that when you died, if you died in battle or had a good death, you would go to Valhalla. And people tend to regard Valhalla as a realm as well, but it is not meant to be a realm. Valhalla was a hall. It was a hall in Asgard, and because it was a magical place, it didn't really have any sort of finite boundaries, but it was a place where all of the glorious dead would assemble and feast with Odin every night. So if you died in battle, and Vikings were gung-ho to be able to do that, because the last thing a Viking wanted to do is die in their sleep and end up in Niflheim or Muspelheim, the sort of purgatories of the Viking universe. But if you died a glorious death, you would go and you would feast nightly in Valhalla. And this is fascinating because, again, we think about the way we view the world today in the 20th century and the way we sort of imagine being able to die and go to heaven. I'm sure most people these days would love to peacefully die in their sleep and go on to whatever their final reward is. But the Vikings, that was a completely horrifying idea. Vikings wanted to die in battle. They wanted to die a glorious death, give glory to the gods and move on to Valhalla. Men and women. The women in the Viking world were just as much warriors as the men were. We know that what they often refer to as shield maidens were very real. The Valkyrie, an important sort of a warrior concept in Viking religion, were primarily female or exclusively female. But the thing that was great about Valhalla is that so you would go to Valhalla when you died and you would feast gloriously every night. And every morning you would wake up, you would go out onto the battlefield and you would fight your brothers basically for fun. Almost everyone died. And then the Odin would resurrect you all and bring you back to the feast for the next night. And so basically what these Vikings wanted, their idea of heaven, was to feast all night, battle until they died every day, be resurrected by Odin, and go through it all over again. So that was quite an afterlife that they had to look forward to.
Yeah, I'm going to sit that one out.
I don't know. It sounds like it could be fun. If you knew you were going to come back every day and battle was that glorious, I could imagine that it's
right.
At least for a
But
while.
these are the kind of things that happen whenever you have no separation between church and state. And I will point out that in 1095, whenever Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade, he actually said that if you die in battle during this crusade, your sins would be forgiven, and then you would go straight to heaven. So that's not the first time that this has ever been used.
No,
And if
definitely
you think
not.
that's a foreign concept, people are still blowing things up today in the name of God.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
unfortunate but true. I'm afraid that, that some world religions have become more warlike, in the modern era than I think we'd like them to be. Um,
Yes.
so we were discussing the different realms, and among the realms was Jotunheim. Jotunheim, the land of the frost giants. Now, the frost giants, or the Jotun, which is singular, or Jotnar, the plural, race of giants that were fated to battle the Aesir when the world ended, which was a very real time, according to the Norse. They believed, most Norse would have believed that the end of creation, which they called Ragnarok, was going to happen within their lifetimes. They believed it was a very real thing, and that's one of the reasons why they were so gung-ho to impress the gods, to go out raiding, to come back bearing gold and jewels, to impress the gods and prepare for the end of time. But the Jotnar were these sort of icy mystical beings who were considered to be sort of demigods unto themselves, but they were sort of the goblins or the devils of the Norse religion. And the leader of the Jotnar, or the leader specifically of the frost giants, was Ymir. Ymir, the ruler of the frost giants in the frozen realm. And it was believed that it was from the realm of Jotunheim that the gates would be open, allowing the freezing, sort of winter to spread across the earth at the end of time, because the Vikings believed that Ragnarok, the end of days, would be ushered in by a period called the Thimble Winter. The Thimble Winter was the age of ice, and it was supposed to last for 3 solid years, where the sun would never show itself, where the earth would basically die under this assault of ice and snow and bitterness, until virtually all of humanity was wiped out. And this would usher in the time of the twilight of the gods, the great age of Ragnarok. And this was both the feared end of Norse, sort of the Norse universe, but also a time that would be of the greatest glory. If you lived through to see Ragnarok, you would be, able to sort of make it into the greatest battle of all time. In fact, if you died before Ragnarok and were one of the, I believe they called them the Einarjar, the glorious dead, Odin would bring you into battle so that you could fight with them at Ragnarok. And so again, quite an interesting end. But they believed that their world, unlike, again, modern, so many modern religions, Christianity is always an easy one because we are so familiar with it here, where you die, you go to heaven, and that's eternity. They didn't believe that their world was going to be eternal. They believed that even the gods would eventually die in this great battle to end all battles.
Yes, yes, yes. And we also have in Christianity, in Christian belief, and a lot of Protestant belief, the idea of tribulation. And that has a lot to do with this as well, too. It shows really, I think, whenever we start analyzing myths, when we start analyzing religions, is how truly similar we are. There's not a lot of differences. There's far more similarities than there are differences.
As I think that's very, very true. And you imagine that so many of us, again, are descended from these peoples, and that just when we discussed this quite a bit when we did our episode last year on witchcraft, is that so many of the traditions of older customs, older cultures, ended up being rolled in some way to, to sort of the later religions. Now, by about 1000, 1100 or so, the Vikings had largely been converted to Christianity, although certainly there was still some holdouts in there. But the Christian religion was overlaying what they already believed in, and some of the talismans that you find from that time. There are Thor's hammers from that time, Thor hammer pendants, that actually look more like crosses than they look like hammers, but were considered to be Thor's hammers, because you had this, again, it wasn't just a switching on one, off one light and on another. It was a complete sort of fusion of these two faiths that eventually ended up sort of rolling into one.
Yeah, yeah. Just fascinating. Definitely.
Now, here's an interesting one that I think has a great deal to do with the way that the modern world views Christian religion, and sort of the idea we talked about hell. Is the other realm of giants was the realm of Muspelheim, which was ruled over by Surt. And Surt, the great powerful fire giant who looks so very much like, or appears so much very much like, what we think of as the devil. He was the king of Muspelheim, prophesied to set Asgard ablaze during the final battle of Ragnarok. So he was going to be the one that truly destroyed the realm of the gods. And so here we have this sort of bestial, great horned beast, sort of brimming with fire. And while interestingly, in old biblical myth, hell is not often referred to as being fiery. It's bled so much into later ideas that hell is a place of fire, and you can certainly see again how that may have been influenced by the Norse beliefs, because the different Norse realms of the giants and the dead really did sort of intersect with one another, and all of those rolled together may well give us our modern conception of what we think of when we think of hell.
Yeah, great point, actually.
So we were going to talk about Loki, the sort of brother and or uncle of Thor. As I say, the relationships sometimes are a little bit muddy in these old myths. But Loki is, I think, one of the most intriguing of the Vanir, or the Aesir, the Norse gods, because Loki wasn't precisely born to be a god. Loki was actually born of the union of a giantess and a goddess. And so the giantess Angerboda, a giant called Angerboda, and a goddess had this child who basically was half frost giant, and he was adopted by Odin, or again seen to be the half brother of Odin. It does become very complicated, and I apologize about that, because these myths were written by different people in the different sagas. But Loki was always seen as the wild card. He was the changeling god who could shapeshift. He was not of the Aesir but adopted by them, and he was the god of mischief. Some people call him the god of evil, but he was the most mysterious of the Aesir. And Laufey and the Angerboda gave birth to this god, who became the great trickster. Now, we see these trickster gods in a lot of different cultures as well. We see these gods who are wavering in their loyalty, who you don't know if they're going to fall on your side or end up betraying you. And so Loki frequently played tricks on the gods. He often played tricks on his brother and or nephew Thor. We should just call him brother to make it easier, but the point is, as I say, that they can be easily crossed over. But he was constantly traveling with Thor, going on adventures. One of the great things about Norse myth is that it is full of stories. It's very much like old Greek mythology. It's full of stories where the gods go out into their world or into ours and have adventures. And Loki and Thor got up to a lot of adventures and a lot of mischief, because that was what Loki did. And Loki was frequently talking Thor into doing things that he did not want to do. He talked him at one point into dressing up as a woman. Thor, who, by the way, was always portrayed as this hugely burly, hairy, red-bearded, great god, convinced him to dress up as a woman and pass himself off as a potential mate for a giant once. And these kind of things, obviously that did not end well, but these kind of things happened all the time. In fact, that old comic that I first read, that very first Thor comic that I read, was one of the great adventures of Thor and Loki. And in it, as they were traveling, they stopped to get a drink, and they stopped at a sort of a peasant's hut. And the peasant recognized them as gods, said, there's nobody can possibly miss Loki and Thor. I know exactly who you are. I'm going to challenge you guys to a drinking contest. And Thor says, absolutely, I'm down for a drinking contest. And he says, all you need to do is drink this horn of wine. And if you drink this horn of wine, you win the contest. And Thor, of course, laughs, takes the horn, takes a drink out of it, looks at, he's barely dropped the level of it at all, drinks it again, and barely drops the level. And eventually he starts to get angry, and he just guzzles this horn of wine, and eventually he drains it by about a quarter before he cannot drink another drop, and he is humiliated. But now Thor's angry, and so he wants another test. And the peasant says, "That's fine. That's my house cat. If you want to pick up my house cat, and you've won the challenge." So Thor goes to pick up the house cat, and he can't pick it up. He cannot get the thing off the floor. He manages to pick up one paw of the house cat, and then has to give up on it. So at this point, Loki says, listen, obviously you're not at your best today. Let me do it. And so the peasant challenges Loki to an eating contest, and Loki says, "I can out eat anybody." So the two of them sit at either ends of a table, piled with wonderful food. They both start eating. Loki finishes his plates in no time and notices the peasant is not just eating the food, he's eating the plates, he's eating the table, he's eating everything, and consumes far more than Loki ever could. At the end of all of this, when all of these different contests and Thor and Loki, these two wonderful gods, can't figure out how they were bested by this peasant, and they're very angry, they learn that this was not a peasant at all, that he is a god in disguise, and that the horn, the other end of the drinking horn, was actually in the sea, and that Thor had actually lowered the level of the sea. That the cat that Thor thought that he was trying to lift was actually Jormungandr, the World-Serpent, the great serpent that circles the world. And this massive serpent, Thor managed to pick a small portion of him up off the seabed. And so at this point, he's done two remarkable feats without even realizing it. And last but not least, the eating contest was against this person that he was actually competing against fire, which consumes everything, and so not even a god can consume more than fire. So again, it's just these wonderfully rich, very, very mythic, clever stories that don't have any particular significance other than to sort of, I think, show humility in the gods, and that even the gods are fallible. So it's a wonderful, if you have never read, I'm talking to you in the studio audience now, if you have never read the old Norse mythology, I so highly recommend it. There's some of the most wonderful and rich stories, and I would recommend them to absolutely anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's these great stories of hubris, but we see ourselves in these gods, like you said. The
Very
idea of
humanizing, yes.
greed and gluttony and all that other kind of stuff. So we see a piece of ourselves in there, and then we can learn from the mishaps of the gods themselves.
Now we are, as is not unusual at all, we've eaten up great bit of our time. And there's quite a few things that I wanted to cover before we go. So a couple of quick things that I want to run through. Loki, among other things, among being sort of the god of mischief and often referred to as the god of evil, was in many ways the architect of the end of the gods, architect of Ragnarok in a lot of ways, because Loki, as a shapeshifter, always tricking people, but also had several children. In different forms, Loki had mated with different beings throughout the course of his time and given birth to some extraordinary creatures. So the children of Loki are some of the most fascinating figures in Norse mythology. One of the most notable of Loki's children is at one point he takes the shape of a horse and mates with a stallion who was the work stallion of a person who was building a wall around Asgard. And I won't go into the details of the story because we don't have that much time, but Loki becomes impregnated because, yes, indeed, as I say, as a shapeshifter, he became a female horse and gives birth to Sleipnir. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but this was the war horse of Odin, a mighty stallion with 8 legs who could run faster than the wind. This is a fascinating character, but most of Loki's children were not so useful. One of Loki's most horrifying offspring was Hela herself, the goddess of death, a woman who is a beautiful woman on one side and a withered corpse on the other. And as far as the realm of Hela, which is called Hell, as we mentioned, those who could not enter Valhalla were condemned to this misty domain, from whom the Christian hell does take its name. Because if you did not die in battle, if you died peacefully in your sleep, it often meant that you were a coward or, just insufficient, and so you were condemned to be one of Hela's minions. Another very notable character from the sort of loins of Loki was the great wolf Fenris. Fenris, the great wolf, who was so powerful and so impossible to control that originally, while Fenris roamed free, he would savage and eat people with abandon. So they eventually had to chain him in Niflheim to keep him out of trouble. And they couldn't chain him with any normal chain because no mortal chain would hold him. So it said that they made a chain from, I believe it was the breath of a fish, the sound of a cat's paws, and other sort of mystical things. So all of these sort of impossible things were forged together by the dwarves into the only chain that could hold Fenris. But at the end of time, to usher in the Fimbulwinter, the great winter, to usher in Ragnarok, it was believed that Fenris would devour the sun and cause that beginning of that age of darkness. And last but not least, probably the most frightening of Loki's children was one we mentioned a few minutes ago, Jormungandr, the World-Serpent. Now, the World-Serpent was supposed to battle Thor at the end, at the great battle. And Jormungandr was fated to be slain by Thor in the final battle, but not before poisoning the thunder god. And shortly after destroying Jormungandr, Thor would finally die. And Thor's death basically would signal the end of Ragnarok and the sort of the age of darkness. Now, the thing about Ragnarok is that, as I said, it's the end of the realm of the gods. All of the gods would be dead, and the sort of end of the world, including the end of the mortal world, would happen. And so this battle was both the most glorious thing in the Viking world, but also in a strange way meant to be one of the most promising. Because we were talking about the fact that the Vikings or the Norse people, that a lot of what they had sort of echoes later Christian belief and may have even influenced it. At the end of time, it was believed that one god would resurrect from the dead, and that was Balder. We were talking about Balder earlier, Balder the Beautiful, Balder the Pure, Balder the Brave, he was called. But in the story of Balder, much like Achilles from Greek myth, Balder was so perfect that his mother, Frigga, put a spell on him so that no mortal weapon could touch him, or that nothing could kill him. So she walked through the world and she whispered to every single object that it could not hurt him, it could not touch him, and this spell was supposed to protect Balder from all harm. But unfortunately, the mistletoe, which often grows under the leaves of an oak tree and is easy to miss, was overlooked by Frigga. So it was the one thing that she forgot. And Loki, having discovered this, ended up convincing a blind god, and I wish I could remember his name. I'm sorry, I can't remember the blind god's name, but convinced a blind god that he should take his turn, as everybody did as part of a game, trying to hit Balder with weapons, and he handed him an arrow made of mistletoe, and it slayed Balder. It slayed Balder, and it basically it ushered in the beginning of the end of the gods. But Balder was the one god that would become resurrected, and so Balder being slain rises from the dead at the end of Ragnarok and ends up presiding over the rebirth of the world. And it turns out that two humans, one man and one woman, would have survived even the great battles of Ragnarok. And those two humans, with their one great shining god Balder, would end up recreating the earth. And if that doesn't sound like the beginning of the sort of Christian creation, I don't think anything does. I mean, I think it's remarkable when you think about the fact that you have this Adam and Eve figure in this shining resurrected god that would usher in the beginning of a new world.
Yeah, it's actually very beautiful too, and shows the cyclical nature of the way the world is going to be as well too. That there's a beginning and then there's an end, and then it starts all over again, which is kind of interesting. I saw Pepper Jackie said about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. One of the things I do want to stress too, because this is such a lengthy kind of proposal to go in there and read the edices and things of that nature. What I can recommend you to do, especially if you want to look at the ideas of this synthesis between Viking culture and Christianity, is to go out there and read Beowulf, which is probably an oral tradition that dates probably well into the Viking Age, a pre-Christian Viking Age, but it was written during, or at least adjusted to, Christian ideology by the time it actually made its way into print. But you can see a lot of this stuff in there, just the same way that Thor dies from the poison of the dragon, so too does Beowulf die from the dragon in there as well too. So you see a lot of similarities in there. So yes, I would just point that out. If you are interested in this kind of ideology, this kind of mythology, I think Beowulf kind of blends these two worlds together very nicely.
So folks, we have drawn to the end of our hour. Again, as always, we're sorry for rushing through at the end there, as we always overpack things a little bit. Want to thank you guys so much as ever for coming on with us tonight. If you are interested in Norse mythology, I do highly recommend picking up any of the many books that retell all these wonderful old stories. Ron is quite correct. Reading the Eddas can be a little bit daunting. They can be very dense language and not necessarily easily swallowed by modern audiences. But the Norse myths have been translated into a lot of wonderful editions. If you want to see a really fun but highly sort of adapted version, go ahead and pick up Thor Ragnarok or one of the other Marvel Thor-based films. It's certainly a very fun, if incredibly loose, retelling of a lot of these stories, but it does have a great deal of fun and entertainment. And with that, Ron, as always, thank you so much for chatting with me tonight. Always great to have you here, and always great to have you folks along. We will see you in 1 week for the next episode. And you may have noticed our opening Monday night mysteries, myths, and monsters, our new broader scope. And so we're very much looking forward to seeing you guys in 1 week. You all have a wonderful night.
Yeah.